Fazemos um compasso de espera. 2, 3 minutos e começamos. Está ali mais alguém? Não vou ajudar.
Teste. Teste, 1, 2, 3. Queres que eu consiga o microfone? I'll present you, I'll get off stage, and then... Yeah, I'm going to say that. Ok, então, boa tarde, vou tirar isto, não está a dizer nada. Boa tarde, bem-vindos. Só dizer duas palavras em português antes de começar em inglês, para agradecer a vossa presença. Quer quem está aqui em sala connosco, quer para quem nos está a acompanhar em casa através da transmissão em direto que estamos a fazer no YouTube neste momento. E com a vossa permissão, vou dar para inglês. So, switching to English, welcome once again, Professor Dominic McIver Lopes. My name is Gonçalo Marcelo, and I will be hosting today's workshop. As you might know, Professor Dominic McIver Lopes is a specialist in philosophical aesthetics, He has been working over the past few decades on topics like aesthetic pluralism, aesthetic injustice, the ethics of artificial intelligence. He proposes the network theory as his own take on aesthetics, and notably with his theory of aesthetic pluralism. He's staying with us here at the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the Center for Classical and Humanistic Studies, sponsored by a Gulbenkian Fellowship. His stay started at the beginning of December 2025. He's staying with us until the end of February. And in the middle of several other activities, we have 3 workshops, a series of 3 public workshops in January. We had January with Biennale and Museum. This is the second on aesthetic injustice, and we will also have a third one next week on January 26th, precisely on aesthetic pluralism. And so I don't think I have to present Dom's work or Dom himself anymore, because we are all getting acquainted and used to coming to his lectures and workshops. It is a great pleasure having you here. Let me just finish off by saying that for those of you who want to know more, actually today's workshop, the topic of this workshop on aesthetic injustice, which is Dom's own take, let's say, new field of injustice that it is putting forward by revealing to the extent to which you can have something which is aesthetic about injustice, or a specific kind of injustice, which is aesthetic injustice. And also the case of cultural appropriation have been developed in Oxford University Press and Oxford University Press, precisely called aesthetic injustice. And so we will, of course, continue the discussions after this, but I'll stop here and give the floor to Dominic McIver. Stop. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
I'll just myself here.
As I said last time, please feel free to interrupt me if I'm not speaking clearly, or if I say something you don't understand, or if I'm using jargon that's not familiar to you. I'm happy to be interrupted for any of those reasons. I'm going to split this talk in 2. So I'll speak for a few minutes, and then we'll take a break and have some discussion, and then I'll give the second half of the talk. I'm going to tease you with the second half of the talk, which will come following this second. So I have just completed a set of 3 books, a trilogy. These are the 3 books. On last Monday, I talked about being for beauty and the network theory of self-value. Today, I'm going to give you a little appetizer of some of the fare that's in Aesthetic Injustice, the most recent book, the one that Gonzalo just mentioned. Aesthetic injustice. I mean something specific by this, and I mean something that I think is going to be unfamiliar. This is unusual in philosophy. Usually in philosophy, we provide theories or theoretical accounts of phenomena with which we are already intimately and concretely familiar. So you know from your own experience what consciousness is. A philosopher might be interested in giving a theory of consciousness that answers to our experience of consciousness. Or you know what a person is, and a philosopher might give a theory of personhood that answers to our experience of personhood. Or you know what knowledge is roughly, and an epistemologist will give you an account of knowledge, answers to our awareness of what knowledge is in our lives and how we work with it. Aesthetic injustice, as I understand it, is an unfamiliar phenomenon. So what I need to do is describe it and then show that it exists. Because I don't think we're very familiar with its existence. So here's the rough style of argument that I'm going to get. I'm going to argue that aesthetic injustice is closely related to something else that we are familiar with. That phenomenon that we're familiar with, I'm going to call weaponized aesthetics. And I'm going to try to argue that aesthetic injustice is generated by weaponized aesthetics, and it also makes weaponized aesthetics worse. And if weaponized aesthetics is real, and aesthetic injustice has effects on it, and is affected by it, then it's real too. So that's the style of argument that I'm going to do. So the idea is that aesthetic injustice is kind of unfamiliar to you, but weaponized aesthetics is familiar to you. My case study for today is going to be cultural appropriation. So this is something that is, I don't know about here in Portugal, but where I come from, it's discussed a lot. It's discussed a lot in academic circles. It's just discussed a lot in the press. It's discussed a lot in social media. People will post messages asking whether some activity that they're engaged in is an example of cultural appropriation. We want to know what it's talking about. Well, here's a couple of examples of cultural appropriation. On the left, you have one of the Benin bronzes. This was a set of almost 200 bronzes in what is now Nigeria that were looted in 1897 by the British Army. They just stole them, they took them. They brought them to Europe and they were distributed around Europe. There might even be some in Portugal, I'm not sure. But they're all over Europe and in the United States. Some of them are being repatriated, sent back in recognition of the fact that they were taken illegally. Are any of you familiar with the controversy about Victoria's Secret? So not something that made the press here. You know what Victoria's Secret is? Yes, you know what Victoria's Secret is? Okay, good. So you know what Victoria's Secret is. In 2012, they put on a runway show for underwear and night clothes, and they used symbols from Native American cultures. So this model is wearing this feathered headdress. It's called a war bonnet. It's in fact a Dakota Sioux trailer war bonnet. And this caused a lot of blowback, and Victoria's Secret was forced to apologize and retract. So there's another example of cultural appropriation that you might think is problematic. These examples of cultural appropriation that I've just given you illustrate weaponized aesthetics. So here's what weaponized aesthetics is. First, it's a relatively large-scale social arrangement. So it's not an individual action. It's a pattern of behavior in society or in a culture, or it's a policy, or it's a norm. So it's a relatively large-scale social arrangement of aesthetic culture. I'm going to say more about what I mean by that. That stems from and contributes to social injustice. So social injustice is when you have a hierarchy that disfavors members of some groups because they are members of those groups along morally significant dimensions of their well-being, like healthcare, education, bodily integrity, and so on. So the thought is that these examples are examples of relatively large-scale social arrangements, practices of theft or practices of using people's aesthetic cultures, other people's aesthetic cultures, in a way that keeps them down, keeps them on the downside. Notice here that in weaponized aesthetics, we have an aesthetic means, culture is being used as an instrument towards a non-aesthetic end. Moral harms to people in their morally significant dimensions of their well-being. So non-aesthetic ends. Healthcare, education, political participation, bodily autonomy, that sort of thing. So that's characteristic of weaponized aesthetics. That's why I call it weaponized aesthetics. Because here you have aesthetic culture being instrumentalized to produce non-aesthetic social effects. Right. So this is a huge body of literature in philosophy and in the humanities and in the social sciences about weaponized aesthetics. Right? So you should be familiar with this. This is just like mountains and mountains and mountains of scholarly production. So here, in this case of cultural appropriation, and defending laws as well, you will have aesthetic policies that produce social injustice by, for instance, dispossessing people of their property, theft, or misrepresenting them, showing them as not in a way that's not accurate and is therefore harmful to them, by disrespecting them. In the popular discussion, this is often put in terms of being offensive, but I think it's better to think in terms of disrespect. That's disrespectful. And perhaps assimilating, where minority cultures are forced to blend into a majority. So, I mean, this is, if you don't know the full story of indigenous cultures in North America, this is really terrible because the trailer war bonnet is only worn by men, only on important ceremonial occasions, and only by men who have earned high regard from their communities. So to like turn it into just a consumable or a prop made for selling consumables is to completely disrespect its meaning for the people who made it. And when you could completely disrespect its meaning for the people who made it, that might have an assimilative effect. It might cause them to assimilate into larger society. There are symbols that make them different from everybody else. I'm not empty of meaning. Okay, so that's weaponized aesthetics. It's a relatively large-scale social arrangement that uses aesthetic cultures as an instrument to produce a social harm. And it exists, and there's a lot of literature on it, and I'm fine with that literature. I think it's great. No critique of that literature here. Here's what I mean by aesthetic injustice. So here's the phenomenon that I'm going to try to argue is a real phenomenon. It exists, but it's an unfamiliar one. It's also a relatively large-scale social arrangement. So don't think about individual actions here. Think about norms or policies and groups. It harms people in their capacities as aesthetic agents. So it involves an aesthetic harm. Oh, I should be out of it. Harms people in their capacities as aesthetic agents. So instead of a non-aesthetic harm, social injustice, we have an aesthetic harm. And I think it's important to recognize the possibility of aesthetic harm. And the aesthetic harm comes up to the level of injustice because it undermines two interests. Oh, either one of two interests that I think we have. One is an interest in there being diverse aesthetic cultures, and the other is an interest in social autonomy. What's unfamiliar in this is number 3A and B. What I mean by an interest in diverse aesthetic cultures is not obvious, and I'm not going to tell you about it, you have to buy the book. What I mean by an interest in social autonomy is also not obvious, but I will tell you about it. Okay, so that's the one I can't give you everything in one little workshop. Okay, so I have something specific in mind by social autonomy, hence the interest in social autonomy, hence undermining that interest in social autonomy. Okay, so we need to know something more about what these capacities are and what these interests are, and also what aesthetic cultures are. So here I'm going to just touch on some of the ideas that I presented last Sunday. But if you weren't there, I should be saying enough that you should get up to speed. These are three different aesthetic cultures, right? Obvious, right? Obvious to everybody. There's the aesthetic culture of rickshaws in Mumbai. There's the aesthetic culture, if you don't know what this is, that's a kwak carving. And then this is a cosplay group, right, in Harajuku in Tokyo. So there's this neighborhood in Tokyo, and if you're into this sort of thing, that's where you go and you parade, and you buy your stuff too. And these are examples of aesthetic cultures where values vary. So the rickshaw is glorious. And the ovoids, the shapes in that carving are tight, taut, pulled together. And the folks in their costumes there are kawaii. That's Japanese for cute. But cute in Japanese means way more than it means for us. So kawaii, okay? So those are 3 different aesthetic values that are specific to those aesthetic cultures. If you think about it for a minute, you realize that we live our aesthetic lives in many, many different ways, realizing many, many different values. I think that's a really great thing about that platform. In each of these aesthetic cultures is a little world. Let's take the rickshaw. There's a guy who drives the rickshaw. Maybe he decorated it. Maybe he hired somebody, a rickshaw artist, to decorate it for him. Maybe it's a kind of a collaborative thing. Maybe Portuguese tourists bring stickers and he puts the stickers on the rickshaw. Like, there are a number of different activities there. And then there are museums of rickshaws. There are collectors who collect these rickshaws. If you start to Google, you realize that people are fascinated by this, and there are lots of images, and there are people who write about it, and look at these entries. There's probably lit rickshaw criticism. You should take this one. This one's better than that one. Aesthetically better than that one. So there's a world of rickshaw aesthetic culture in which a number of different players are playing different roles. They're coordinating and cooperating with each other. And they're able to do that because they agree on what it takes to make a good rickshaw. Right? If they disagreed on that, they wouldn't be able to cooperate. So they cooperate. So the word I want to underline here is we have a cooperative social network. We have a social network in which people cooperate, and they cooperate because they agree on the values. And that's the same thing is happening with carving culture, and in Tokyo with the cosplay culture. What makes this kawaii is a product of an agreement among a bunch of people about what to do to make things cute. And that can change, of course. Like maybe pink is kind of going out, there's more lavender. I don't know. Like it can change over time. That's because people decide to do things slightly differently. Okay, so that's the idea. We have different cultures made up of worlds of people who are cooperating around shared conceptions of these things. So that's what I said on Monday. Here, I want to give you a little bit of a taste of next Wednesday and suggest that these cultures have value profiles or schemes of value that are plural. What do I mean by this? I mean 5 things. Number 1, their values vary. There's no kawaii in kwak, right? It just doesn't exist. What it takes to be glorious in kawaii and rickshaw culture are different. You have to do different things. So the values differ by culture. No big deal, that's straightforward. They're valid in those cultures. What I mean by that is each value in that culture gives members of the culture reason to act. So if you ask the middle girl why she's got blue hair, she'll say this blue hair represents courage. And that's my reason for having blue hair. So blueness being kind of a representation of courage, and that value gives her a reason to act. perfectly valid reason to act. When she gives you that answer, you say, okay, now I understand what you're trying to do. So, third, they're incommensurable or non-comparable. Which is better, the glory of the rickshaw or the kawaii, the cuteness of the coast? There's no good answer to that question. How do you even begin to decide which is better? I don't think one is better than the other, nor are they equal in value. Comparisons they're not meaningful. Comparisons are only meaningful within the culture, not across culture. If you want, we can talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, fourth, this is important. They're compatible. The values in different value schemes are compatible with each other. Let me give you an example of incompatible values. So on the right, you have Mohandas K. Gandhi on one of his marches. He's embodying the ethics of satyagraha, peaceful resistance. And on the right, you have, well, it's from a movie, it's from a Kurosawa movie, but you have a couple of samurais, and they embody the ethics of the Bushido, the code of the warrior. And satyagraha and the Bushido are incompatible with each other. One speaks against the other. One condemns the other. It's in principle impossible to realize them both in the same nature or in the same world. The ideal world could not be a world both with satyagraha and Bushido. One of them has to go. So that's what I mean by value schemes being incompatible. We tend to think that when values provide culture, and they're valid within those cultures, and they're non-comparable, they're incompatible. This is Isaiah Berlin, right? So this is the dominant idea of pluralism, that when you have the first three, you get incompatibility. But that's because all of these pluralists focus on the case of ethics. But aesthetics is different. You guys are into this thing on the left-hand side, football, and I'm into this thing on the right-hand side. I kind of get football, soccer, but it's not really my cup of tea. But you know what? I'm glad it exists. And I think that if you're a decent person, you probably think, hockey, I know Canadians like hockey, I don't really understand it, but you are happy that it exists. You don't think that if Ronaldo's strike at the goal is beautiful, that means that Haley Wittenheiser, her shot, is not beautiful. What can be beautiful and what can't be? Even if you don't understand what makes her shot beautiful, you should be willing to say, oh yeah, it can be beautiful. Right? So, athletic values are compatible, and aesthetic values in sport are compatible with each other, and I think that aesthetic values in everything are compatible with each other. So, the rickshaw owner who is proud of the liveliness of his rickshaw does not have to think that that takes anything away from the cuteness of the coastline kids in Tokyo. Even if he doesn't understand it. All right, so values are compatible. As I just suggested in giving my explanation of why I think they're compatible, they are more or less mutually comprehensible. So when you hear a new kind of music, there'll be something you can get. There'll be something you can get. There'll be something you can hold on to, even if it's very unfamiliar. Right? There'll be something you can hold on to. And so maybe less mutually comprehensive than, you know, you hear a new variant on a type of music with which you're very familiar, then you'll understand a lot. So there's a lot of overlap between the profiles of, dare I say, Portuguese and Spanish cooking. less between Portuguese and French cooking, less between Portuguese and Canadian cooking, right? So how much you get will be an artifact, a function of how much overlap there is between the profiles. That's just a variable matter. There's a historical explanation of it, but not really in principle philosophical. Okay, so value, the aesthetic value profiles, what makes that aesthetic culture the one that it is, its way of generating beauty, what makes the Kwak aesthetic culture the one that it is, its way of generating beauty, what makes the Kawaii aesthetic culture the one that it is, its way of generating beauty. Those are all different value profiles. They all have these thoughts and characteristics, I think. Okay, so I said that I would, let me just say one thing. Oh, I seem to be missing a slide. Okay, I'll have to just explain it. Respect. Because aesthetic value profiles have these 5 characteristics, they make possible an attitude on the part of individuals and also groups, an attitude of respect. The notion of respect that I'm using comes from Joseph Raz, and it's not the usual, it's not like Kantian respect or anything like that. Raz contrasts engagement with respect. So engagement is this. You live in Mumbai, you drive a rickshaw, you're part of this culture, and its values cause you to act. Maybe you decorate your rickshaw, pictures of other people's rickshaws, great drink for the Bombay Times, right? And they cause you to do things. If you're not immersed in rickshaw culture, you don't engage. Probably nobody in this room belongs to the rickshaw aesthetic culture. None of us have an opportunity to accept this appreciation. We're outside, even then, what do we know about that? Very little, right? You need a handful of examples in your life. That's not much to go on as an appreciator. Very much or not. So we're outsiders. And because the aesthetic values are compatible and more or less mutually comprehensible, we can respect the values even though we don't engage. For Raz, when you engage values, you act on them. Values are for acting on, principally. So when you engage values, when you respect them, you take a positive attitude. But respect for Raz has a very important feature. When you respect a value, you don't just say, I think it's okay, but you have an understanding of why that value is valid for its others. Gives them. Okay, so take Misty Copeland, the ballet dancer, or the American ballet dancer. She might see a South Indian dance. She might see Kathakali performance. She is not a member of the world of Kathakali. She will not engage Kathakali, but she might see how the aesthetic values in this performance give the dancers a reason to do what they do. She can appreciate that they have the kind of reason to do what they do that she has as a ballet dancer. So respect is a positive attitude in light of knowledge of why the values are reason given. So it's different from this. I have no idea why you're doing what you're doing, but I respect your right to do it. That is a very thin conception of respect. That's not what Raz is talking about. That's not what I'm talking about. Respect is this. It's not my cup of tea. I'm not going to do the same. You have reasons to do what you're doing, just like the things that I have to do what I'm doing. That's a richer conception of respect? All right, so when you're an outsider, you can, to aesthetic life, you can have an attitude of respect. Okay, so we're almost finished, right? Here's what I said the argument would be. Aesthetic injustice stems from endorsements of weaponized aesthetics. So aesthetic injustice is real. I'm giving this argument because I don't think aesthetic injustice is a familiar phenomenon. That's because I haven't yet told you what social autonomy is, but it's going to be something a little bit different from any other notion of autonomy or form. And to make a case for that, we need to see what the relationship is between weaponized aesthetics in the middle of the slide and aesthetic injustice in the bottom of the slide and social autonomy. So I'm going to come back to cultural appropriation. I want to show you some examples of appropriation of weaponized aesthetics. Now, how about if we discuss an example of where we see injustice at play, and where we see the relationship and weaponized aesthetics. Okay, so that's the first round. I thought I'd stop here. Yeah, thought I'd stop here and see. First of all, questions of clarification. Can you say more about this idea, more about that idea? Questions of clarification would be really great. Also, I'm welcome feedback. Too late for me to change. I can change my mind. I can change my mind. And of course, I'm like developing these ideas. It's always great pushback.
We'll have 2 sessions of questions and answers, so and this for people who got in a little bit late. So, quick talk, first half of the talk by Dominic, then I share the questions and answers, we have a little discussion, and then we go to the second part of the presentation. And so, comments, questions? I will just break the ice. Go ahead.
And I think we can IT integrate from the activities into we need to use such to say about key issues very important. The question to read and the knowledge and the epistemology that I prefer to mention to topic. And I think that contemporary times we have some new views about objects and ideas. And it's important to refer to this. I think when you talk about content, I think it's important to content about the symbolic dimension of cultural dimension. Then the cultural experience you can see, and then the didactic expression. Because we are as a faculty and you are using many kind of image, it's very important for us to understand what you are speaking, because if you know, we are perspective and you are introducing here some kind of new forms of learning. And the question, the simple question, the cultural experience of the kids and the didactic expression, like the interpretation, because I think we have lacking interpretation place. We're lacking. We don't know what is a people and what it means, but how we can choose to recognize in this way, with respect for all that we are shooting everywhere, ways, things, directions. And I think the symbolism of inequalities, I think all we can have, and to understand and dialogue in other countries. experience and try to different to dialogue with. Then I think it's the best all of these is more expression. We integrate different kinds and express the relation and a single relation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That wasn't a question. Okay, and
Much more,
I think you're
complete more, and I would like to read more your.
I'm very interested in representation or symbolization. I began my career working on pictures. So I wrote 2 books on pictures. But at this point, I'm thinking of aesthetic life very broadly. So it includes a lot of representational or symbolic cultural consciousness mentality. But it also includes just stuff in the world, and maybe it doesn't have a symbolic or representational dimension. If there is anything like that, or maybe it's representational symbolic is secondary. So I broadened out, and I think it's important to do that. Everything today is about symbolic.
When you talk about the aesthetics, we are talking about philosophy, antique,
Ancient.
ancient philosophy. Because when I also
Yeah.
rather fellowship.
I'm right now, so maybe you should be interested in group chapters of the text, but history of aesthetics. I'm not talking about the text, but something that I noticed. There are many more philosophers than you would expect, for whom aesthetics or beauty is very. But there are also a lot of philosophers for whom it's not important at all. And I wish I could, I think it's a really good question. What distinguishes the two groups? What's holding them? What is it about their views that draws them towards and the views of others that doesn't? And it's not anything, it's nothing obvious. Right?
Yes, yes,
You think so? So that's kind of hermeneutically centered hypothesis. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Locke. What about Locke? Because Locke is all about ideas, which are interpreted. But the problem with the idea of community is that it's a mixed motion, so it requires interpretation. Yeah. But then he just dismisses aesthetics. I don't know. Yeah, it's a good hypothesis.
Actually, I might jump in. Maybe there is a connection with the notion of the notion of interpretation with some of the traits we're using to describe rural value profiles. Yeah, I'm actually trying to make sense of 3, 4, and 5 because you are saying that profiles are incommensurable,
The values in the profile.
the profiles are incommensurable, compatible, and more or less mutually comprehensible. So actually, starting with three, because you are saying that the comparison within culture is not cross-cultural. Because if you're a monist, then you can do cross-cultural comparison because you have web standard of excellence that will apply cross-culturally, because you are pluralist, you want to deny it. And I think it's important actually to deny this because of the issue of but if so, it was just trying to make sense of their compatibility and the possibility to mutually understand. Because for me, you know, when we speak about menstruability, this kind of reminds me of discussions about linguistic agreements, epistemology. I always wonder how deep they are, whether or not there is the possibility of application in the other's standpoint. And I guess that also brings us back to the issue of the interaction and the possibility of passing judgment cross-culturally, which I think is actually important. Coming back to ethnocentrism, I was actually thinking about the quintessential example of ethnocentrism within some of this literature, perhaps, which is, you know, Charles Taylor discussing Saul Bellow and the Zulus, right? Because Saul Bellow was saying that allegedly, well, if people want us to value something produced by the Zulu culture, so let them have their own Asapus or their own Tolstoy. When they have an Asapus or a Tolstoy, then we'll provide value.
That's somebody else. And Charles Taylor talks about
this in multiculturalism.
Yeah.
And he basically gives an improving answer drawing on value to value.
With that fusion of life.
Precisely, precisely. So the thing is, if you want to understand what is valuable within Zulu culture, we cannot appreciate the standards immanent to Western culture or understand what is value, aesthetic value for the Zulu, and we have to, you know, pass judgment, taking into stock their notion of value somehow fused with our own. Do you think that plays a role? Because that's cross-cultural.
So this interacts with what I was saying last Monday about the specificity of aesthetic action. So if you think that our engagement with aesthetic culture is just a thin one, where you kind of drink in the features, like all you need is for some philosopher to put some images on a slide and you go, oh yeah, that's kind of nice, and that's it, that's aesthetics. Then that makes it easy to imagine that there's a feasible fusion of varieties. Maybe you need to do a little bit of work to understand everything that's going on here, or we can like use it off of it, you can find out what you like, right? But if you reject that, if you think that aesthetic culture is not about opportunities for liking, but opportunities for action, then, okay, you can dance. You show up in my neck of the woods, and you're at a potlatch. I'll show you a potlatch in a minute. Big gathering of indigenous people. If there's anything going on, I bet you won't know what to do. You won't know what to do. It'll be literally, I have no idea what to do. They say, come and dance, we'll be on. Right? It's too big an ask. Or, you know, you get one of those emails from Bombay saying, come and be a rickshaw designer. And you look at this and you say, okay, I can do that. No, you can't. You probably can't. Maybe you can decide if you like it or not. That's the conception. Or can you actually engage thickly in the activity? So the more thickly you understand the activity and the makeup of what we do, the more plausible it is that the values really are non-fungible. So Ruth Chang, she's the leading scholar on non-comparability. Her go-to example of non-comparability is chalk and cheese. What's chalk? Chalk, cheese, right? And Queijo. Chalk or cheese? So now, you can imagine you're in a practical context, and you were given a choice, chalk or cheese, which is better?
The Portuguese equivalent would be Irish values. The two things that have nothing to do with
They
Panama.
have nothing to do with each other in practical context.
Yes.
So, okay, if you want to write on the board, chalk, not pizza, right? If you want something to eat, pizza, not chalk. What are you trying to do? Eat or write on the board? There's no answer to the question, chalk or cheese, unless you know whether you're eating or writing on the board, right? So once you fix the practical context, then you can say what they said. Okay, so imagine this. You have a choice between you're into K-pop, and I say, oh, I just got this new jazz record, you should kind of listen to. And you can say, those are different cultures, right? You can say, I'm going to stick with the K-pop. And I could say, are you saying that K-pop is better than jazz? Or imagine it the other way, like I want to keep low value judgments here, right? You're saying K-pop is better than jazz. And you could say, no. It's just that I want to do the kind of appreciating, the kind of listening that K-pop requires. I don't want to do the kind of listening that jazz requires. Or the kind of listening that K-pop requires, I'm going to listen to Baby Monster. I'm not going to listen to Thelonious Monk. Right? So again, people have an intuition, hold on, choose a big choice between Baby Monster and K-pop and Thelonious Monk. Therefore, or we might choose between this and this, therefore, try to practical context. And I say, no. You're actually choosing between two different appreciative activities. K-pop listening versus jazz. Baby Monster is better for K-pop listening than Thelonious Monk. Actually, you can't do K-pop listening with Thelonious Monk any more than you can write on a board. So yeah, so that's how we can run the
The issue is really comfortable because that's what I have it. There will be no respect.
yes,
Right?
exactly.
And not mutual respect, because if there is not mutual respect, if I cannot even grasp the standpoint of the other, then I cannot understand how beauty within that aesthetic culture can provide reasons for action and for meeting my own aesthetic culture. This would bring back many other discussion concerning how close or open are aesthetic cultures, whether or not they really understand the other, but I'll ask you because I don't want to.
And that's why it's more or less so depends, is my opinion.
At this point.
Sure.
So, the question will be another version of Gonzalo's question, because you're talking about aesthetic injustice as agency and property. That's one side of it. But you can have an aesthetic culture that will be gone if we don't do anything to stop that. For instance, Ugaritic culture in Mesopotamia. If you don't study that culture, nobody knows about it. So, how to use a culture that is not ours, without everyone to have agency and property of that culture, and because it will be lost. And I'm not from Mesopotamia, but I think talk about Hebrew culture, of ancient Hebrew culture. So why can we talk about ancient Greek culture in aesthetic? Is an aesthetic culture separated from us, and we cannot talk about culture about Zulus, for instance, in the same way. Or say we make aesthetic assertions about cultural Hebrew culture, um, literary or paintings or whatever. It seems a bit, yeah. And the other thing that you talk about is aesthetics as an opportunity for action. That that is another type of aesthetic injustice. For instance, you can talk about um, aesthetic culture of an orchestra, of music and classical music, but some people in your culture don't have that knowledge, opportunity, etc., to be to have an action in that sense of aesthetic action. In that sense, I don't know if I explained.
Good. I should say some things of clarification.
Yeah.
Okay, so first, a clarification about what a culture is. Second, a clarification about who belongs to a culture. And thirdly, a clarification about contact across cultures. Because you're raising a concern about whether people who complain about cultural appropriation are consistent. Yeah. Okay, so first, about what aesthetic culture is. I have a minimal conception of culture. By that I mean that there are lots of good conceptions of culture, but one good conception is a minimal conception. On the minimal conception, culture is just a regularity of behavior. Okay, so there's the culture of coastline Tokyo. That's just a regularity of behavior in this very specific narrow sense. Bebop is aesthetic culture. Of course, you can go down and be more specific. So there's early 1950s bebop and late 1950s bebop and bebop in Germany in the early 1960s. You can get very specific if you wish. That's all fine. It's just that thin notion of culture. So the notion of culture that I'm using is not like Portuguese culture, which is a combination of several aesthetic cultures, a linguistic culture, a political culture, a legal culture, a family structure, a bunch of things. When I say culture, I'm not talking about that. That's the 19th century herder and beyond conception of culture. I'm thinking of culture just as this regularity of behavior. Okay, so that's the culture. Then, who's in the culture? In other words, who's in the regularity of behavior? Depends on what you're doing. Right? So I said that each of these aesthetic cultures is a little world populated by people cooperating.
You can have a cosplay in America, a
Yeah.
Japanese cosplay.
Yeah. So each of these cultures is a group of people cooperating with each other. That means that you're a member of the culture so long as what you're doing helps the other people. Okay, so maybe you show up in Tokyo and you get yourself a costume and you go into the street, and as a result of your intervention, they're all, remember I talked about achievement? They're all realizing their aims by using their competence. So they're better off because of what you're doing. That makes you a member of the culture. Suppose you're just awful. You get out the costume, you go there, and it's just a disaster. This makes you an outsider. So an insider is somebody who's able to pull their weight. And an outsider is just a bull in a china shop. in English, the expression in English, a bull in a china shop just breaks things. They don't belong there. You belong when you're not breaking things. Okay, so then cultural appropriation contact. This is really important. There's some people who use the expression cultural appropriation in a way that's balanced, so that every act of cultural appropriation is wrong. And I don't use it that way. I use it so that some cases of cultural appropriation are okay, fine, even good, and some are wrong. You have to look at what's going on. So it could be that the cultural appropriation is wrong because of aesthetics, possession, assimilation, representation, disrespect. It could be that's why it's wrong. It could be that it involves an aesthetic injustice. But it can also be good. Everybody writing this literature acknowledges that human beings borrow from each other. We have to borrow from each other. My favorite example of this is Chinese porcelain. You know what that looks like. You think, this is so Chinese. It looks like that because it was made for export to Persia, where there was a ban on images on plates, and there was a ban on using gold and silver for case too long. So the Chinese were making porcelain plates to suit the Persian taste. They were borrowing from them. But now we consider it to be quintessentially Chinese, this floral patterns and so on in China. So borrowing is just a human thing. If we didn't borrow from each other's cultures, we'd get in the water. We just have to do it. So sometimes it goes well, and sometimes it goes poorly. And then the interesting question is, when does it go well? When does it go poorly? Does that answer? Yeah. Yes.
And then perhaps after this conversation, then maybe we go straight.
Sure.
Memory concept. I think memory is the real concept of the canon and the notice of the importance of the notice of rationality. Because cultural experience is only seen by geographical location positions. I think can reduce memory and the rationality because thinking about I think it is about dimensions, about different categories experience. Then when we have this kind of relation one like he's not so far from me, he's far from the person who cares I don't have. We don't have we must have the conflict experience we get the perspective to get inside what meaning, what that cultural means for and the memory are only local geographic experience reduce the kind of global experience. And when we use this discussion with this variation, we can get the connections about different dimensions. I think can be important to when we get connection. It's very important for us to do these different scales in time and space. And if the experience of time, we can get all the experiences and get great text. Because our life, our experience will be.
Yeah. I think we're speak different languages, but I think that there's this idea is there. Instead of using the word memory, I use the word learning. So learning, I mean, learning is acquisition of memory. It applies to learning. Right? So what's learned is going to be relatively stable. You don't learn it. So it's got to be relatively stable and it's hard to. Yeah, that's all.
Yes.
Okay, so
Just sit down
second half.
and yeah, second half.
Okay, part two. Everybody ready? Okay. So I'm going to tell you about Canada. I'm here from Canada. I'm going to talk about Canada a little bit. So there's the author. Okay. I'm going to talk about sex. This is called Black Community. Its full title is The Spirit of Haudenosaunee, made by LV. People in Canada call it Black Community. Do you know about Black Community? You saw it, no? Okay. So there it is. There's a story behind it. So I'm going to tell you this story, and then I'm going to relate it to the ideas that I just presented. So Bill Reed is Haida and Scots. His ancestry is people in Scotland, and it's from people from Haida. Haida is this island marked by the arrow off the coast of British Columbia, where I'm from. I live here in Vancouver, so it's up the coast. This coast is a temperate rainforest. It's very lush. It's full of like trees have moss hanging from it. There's so much life in the forest. There's so much life in the water. As a result, the people, indigenous people who lived along this coast were very wealthy and had relatively highly developed cultures from the American context. Since they were wealthy, they were well armed. Since they were well armed, they would come into conflict. Since they would come into conflict, they would have an interest in mechanisms for producing peace. So they would have these events called a potlatch. This is a potlatch. Potlatch is a diplomatic event and an economic event, basically a market and a cultural exchange. This is a potlatch in 1914. It's a Kwakwakamok potlatch. So up the halfway between Vancouver and Haida. You can see, so at the potlatch, the local community would host all of the other communities. They would come in these huge canoes as long as this room, carved out of cedar, and they would have a big feast and they would exchange gifts and conclude treaties and this sort of thing. It was a very big important occasion. You can see the amount of aesthetic culture that's on display. So there would be carving, and then have to post it back, dance, masks, storytelling, music, you name it. Starting around 1885, at first, not really trying very hard, the Canadian government tried to ban all of this. The intention was to assimilate the indigenous people into the majority of Canada. This potlatch law of 1885 was pretty much ignored until the 1920s. But starting in the 1920s, it was enforced pretty strictly, and potlatches were stopped. And when the potlatch was stopped, cultural exchange stopped. And when cultural exchange stopped, basically people stopped no longer to hide. They lost the songs, they lost the stories, they began to lose the language, dance forms, all of that. Well, Bill Reed, he made Black Canoe that I showed you earlier on. He was an artist in the 1950s. He had trained as a silversmith in London. And he was sitting in London and he thought, what the hell am I doing making jewelry for rich English people? I'm Haida. Why am I not making Haida art? And he answered himself, I don't know how. So he went back home and he figured it out. He and a group of other Haida and Northwest Coast artists figured out this culture. Others recovered the music, recovered the dance, recovered the stories. The language is thriving, it's routinely spoken. So if you go to Haida Gwaii, all the street signs are in Haida. So starting in the 1950s, they really began to recover Haida culture. This is the first painting that he made in the characteristic style of the British Columbia Indigenous artists. They make painting using a restricted vocabulary of shapes. They're called form lines, and I've shown you the form lines on the right-hand side. So you take this restricted vocabulary of shapes and you arrange it to make images or sculptures, furniture boxes. If you come to Vancouver now, this is just everywhere. This kind of art is everywhere. There are lots and lots of artists who are very successful producing art in this style. Well, zoom forward to 1991. The Canadian government is building a new embassy in Washington, D.C. You've heard of this country, the United States. It's our southern neighbor. Trump keeps saying we need to invade Greenland because it's all that stands between Russia and the United States. Actually, Canada's in a way too. So we're kind of worried. Okay, so we had this it's like Portugal in Spain. We're this small country and we're sleeping next to an elephant. Okay, so this is how we think about ourselves. So this embassy is situated halfway between Congress and the White House, across the street from the National Gallery. It's really in a prime location. It's our opportunity to try to show Americans what we are. So Moshe Safdie, the architect who designs the building, and Bill made his commission to produce a monumental bronze for a reflecting pool outside the embassy. So this bronze is huge. It's about 2 meters tall and 4 meters long. Very big. And it's called the Spirit of Haida. It shows one of these dugout canoes, populated by bears from Haida myth. And some of them are in conflict. You can probably see this eagle here biting the bear's claw, but they're paddling together. And there's sheep in the middle who's kind of navigating. Sheep with sheep's crab. Immediately, this went up Canadian scholarship. It became a national icon. So here's Bill Reed's official reason for making this sculpture was to celebrate the revival of Haida culture. But he quickly said this. It expresses something big. Here we are, a long way from Haida Gwaii. Not too sure where we are or where we're going, still squabbling and vying for position in the boat, but somehow managing to appear to be heading in some direction. At least the paddles are together and the man in the middle seems to have some vision of what's to come. So this is a story about a country full of people who from different walks of life who disagree with each other, still managing to make progress. James Tully, political theorist in Canada, wrote a book on multicultural political theory. And in it, he talks of this sculpture, and he says it becomes an ecumenical symbol for the mutual recognition and affirmation of all cultures with respect to their cultures. So the Canadian Constitution has this provision recognizing multiculturalism built into it. So when I grew up in an Israeli neighborhood. Young Portuguese-speaking families moved to Toronto. We're teaching Portuguese in school. Right, so that's a concept right. So that's how Canadians came to see them. A second casting was made, it's called the Jade Canoe, for the airport in Vancouver. Vancouver's on the Pacific Rim. It sees itself as a close to Asia. We're closer to Beijing than we are to Newfoundland. So the Jade Canoe symbolizes that. And then it shows up on the $20 bill in 2004 and stays there till well, 2012, so long. This is the most prestigious banknote in Canada because it's the most in circulation. We don't have a $1 bill in coin. So it's the most in circulation, and it's the only one that's got the sovereign, in this case, the queen, on the other side. The others are foreign prime ministers. Right? So this is the prestige, like this is the one if you're going to be rich and famous. You want to be on this. So there's the black canoe. It really, any Canadian will tell you, oh, the black canoe, I know that. Right? We'll say, oh, that's a national symbol. So Bill Reed really struck it big here. It's a great story. This culture goes from the brink of extinction to a revival in the 1950s to becoming central to Canadian identity by the 1990s. Well, I was talking about cultural appropriation. There never hired an artist there. His name is Michael Nicol Yandalamas. Terribly and we got talking about cultural appropriation because he's not an artist, he's a big-time cultural appropriator in an okay way. So it's one of his best known works is Flight of the Hummingbird, and he tells it's a retelling of a Quechua tale from. So he appropriates a Quechua, and he's famous for Haida. So he takes Japanese manga conventions and the formalized vocabulary and comic books. They're fantastic, they're very popular. Cultural appropriation, again, foreign from China, from Japan. And somebody said to him, is this cultural appropriation? He got a little bit upset. and he said, well, I'll tell you what bothers me is Black Canoe. That's cultural appropriation. He said, his words were, it fixes us in amber. You know amber? From the pine tree, and the ants get stuck in it. You know? So you get stuck. You can't move. It's a paralytic. And I was thinking about this later, and I recall Anthony Appiah, in his book, The Ethics of Our Predators, talking about the Medusa syndrome. When you see the Medusa, you're frozen. What the state recognizes, it tends to turn to stone. Recognition is not that thing, but Appiah is suggesting that there's a form of recognition that isn't that. I was giving this talk in China. In China, my audiences often didn't understand any of this, so it was very important to them. And they really didn't get this idea at all. And I said, I want you to imagine President Xi walks into this room, goes like this, and stares at it. How do you feel? And they got it. They got it immediately. Okay, so the state recognizes the term, tends to turn into. So maybe this is a form of aesthetic injustice. Maybe it's a form of aesthetic injustice that will help us to understand what I mean by social autonomy. So here's a more elaborate version of the argument. How about I could show that the Medusa syndrome harms people in some of their aesthetic capacities with undermining interest in social autonomy of aesthetic cultures. That fits the definition of aesthetic injustice. So they're anti-premise. And that is not the same thing as weaponized aesthetics. But it stems from and worsens weaponized aesthetics. So aesthetic injustice, insofar as it involves application of our interest in social autonomy, is a real phenomenon. It really is. There's a reminder. So there's a little argument. If I can persuade you that the first three steps are true, then maybe we should accept that the final step is true. So start with one. Okay. So and aesthetic cultures are little worlds of social actors who are cooperating each other for personal benefit because they'll each do better what they're trying to do. So long as they agree on what the value profile of the culture is. And in response to Zhao's conversation about how that cooperation is cooperation among insiders. The insiders are the people who help each other to do better. And as a result, they determine what gets done. So if the Hawaii kids do better by using less paint and more lavender, then the set of profiles that lavender is cheerful, lavender is cheerful. They will determine what the aesthetic profile is. So insiders, through their activities, make the profile of the living. What makes the bebop profile is the activities of the musicians and the audience and the record producers and the best jacket designers and the critics and everybody. They're all have the same. Those insiders are the cooperative network. They're all floating each other's boats. They determine the aesthetic profile. If it changes because of what they do, their acts of engagement. And if it stays the same, it's because of what they do, their acts of engagement. We want things to be changing. There are traditional cultures where things don't change, and we should permit them to remain static if that's what they wish. Change is, it's a Western bias towards change. Okay, so you now have the government of Canada staring at Black Canoe, and in fact, 30 million Canadians staring at Black Canoe every time they spend their money, right? And they now have expectations about what high up. And that might ensure the ability of the insiders to determine. It might slow down the dynamism that's there, or it might speed it up. The interest in social autonomy is insiders. It's not that they know, this isn't epistemic injustice, it's not that they know what the aesthetic profile is, but their actions are what make the aesthetic profile of one living. It's a metaphysical form of injustice. So that's what I mean by social autonomy. It's a property of a group, it's not a property of a person. No person determines the profile. Not even Trump. It's a property of a group. It's therefore social. It's autonomy in the sense that it's the engagement of members of the group that determines what the profile is. That's my metaphor. The members of the group hold the destiny of the group in the romance. It's not up to everybody. Okay, you can see that this is going to be an issue whenever you have a recognition of a form of culture by the state, by museums, by libraries, by clubs, by tourist groups. Tourists when tourists go to Thailand and they visit the sites, they are having an effect on what Thai people do, and that might be consistent with the direction they're trying to go, or might undermine their own social life. Okay, so that's why I think what is true. Medusa syndrome fits the definition of aesthetic injustice. I also need to show that it's not identical to weaponized aesthetics. The case of Black Canoe does not involve dispossession. By the time 1991 rolls around, any interaction with Indigenous people in Canada involves elaborate. So Bill Reid, when he was conceiving Black Canoe, would have consulted with the elders, consulted with his community, would have gotten buy-in, might not have been necessarily enough for him to go ahead. You know, those tall actions really were a diplomatic affair. I attended one near where I live, and these huge canoes, they paddled it by, and they were paddled hard so that the canoe beach came up on the side. And there was a row of about 50 canoes. And the local Musqueam elders started at one end, and they got their paddles in a salute, like this, that's a salute. They sit there, and they say who they are. And then the elders say who they are, and they tell the story. And then they're given permission to get out of their canoe and step onto land. And this takes about 45 minutes. And then they move on to the next, and they repeat. And they move on to the next, and they repeat. Nothing happens without a group. So there's no question of dispossession. There's no question of misrepresentation. Black Canoe is an accurate and fair representation of a people's aspiration. It's not disrespectful. It's highly respectful and admirable. And it has not been assimilative in its effect. In fact, Adabad is now independently governed, autonomous region. Okay, so that's the second thing. The Medusa syndrome is not the same as weaponized aesthetics, but there's a relationship to weaponized aesthetics. Why is that? For two reasons. First, when you have weaponized aesthetics, then you are taking people's land, you're taking their language, you're disregarding their legal culture, saying it's not even a real legal culture. You're disregarding their political culture, interfering with it, perhaps interfering with their family structure, definitely interfering with their religion, and missionaries saw to that. So all of those effects of social injustice will make the community less able to resist outsider influence. Their art is more likely to be simply responsive to what outsiders want, rather than responsive to what these artists want. So that's one point. Weaponized aesthetics generate but also aesthetic injustice generates weaponized aesthetics. And I think it's a fair point that when you have an artistic culture or an aesthetic culture that is yours, that is you're in control of, that you have social autonomy over, then you can use it as a tool of resistance. You can use it as a way to articulate to the majority culture that you exist, that you have your own interests, what they are, and what you expect from the majority culture. Undercutting social autonomy, which is what you get in aesthetic injustice, also tends to contribute to weaponized aesthetics, hence social. And I think that's my last slide. So I wanted to argue that aesthetic injustice is a real phenomenon by showing that it interacts with this very familiar phenomenon that everybody around here is studying in detail, weaponized aesthetics. And this is one case. The book also looks at disability and aesthetics, and it looks at bodily beauty ideals as a form of weaponized aesthetics. So there's a whole bunch of case studies. The first half of the book is pure theory. The second half of the book is these. Okay, so that's the appetizer, a little taste of what's in the book. I hope it's given you a desire to read more of the book and to have something to say about it, which means over to you now. Pretty much, right?
Yeah, tonight actually. But I mean, as long as you want, but we should stop more or less at 5. Just because the chair has a board meeting. Okay, so yeah, I do have my questions, but I'll try not to impose. And so, questions, comments, clarifications, objections, suggestions for volume 2 of it. Go ahead.
I actually have a question that if a culture interferes in affecting culture, the other culture has the right to interfere in that culture to stop that influence. I mean, imagine the United States that wants Greenland, right? And does Greenland and the other countries in that in your opinion, the right to interfere the United States culture to stop that vision or try to pass it?
But I've never used the language of rights. I've never talked about rights here. I find it unhelpful. The main reason I find it unhelpful is you ask me how strong these interests are, right? So all I've shown is that we have, if my argument is, all it shows is that we have this interest in social care. And then the other cases in the book talk about some. But how strong is that interest? Is it the most important interest we have? No, we have many more important interests, right? Is it the most important aesthetic interest that I have? No, we probably have other more important interests. So it's just one interest among many that we have. So the way I view things is, here we are, we're a group, we're living our aesthetic life. And what we do seems to be having an impact on those folks. One of the interests that we have that we should think about and take into account is this interest in their social economy. But there's other interests. So this might not be the most important, the dominant, and hence the compelling or the toxic interest. And I think if we use the language of rights, then we better be seeking conclusive reasons. There's another reason why I'm not very warm to the language of rights here, like I am in general, but here, no. That's because probably appealing to rights is not going to be the most effective way to actually solve the problem. It's definitely not going to be, if people are disrespecting the Triller War Bonnet, the Sioux War Bonnet, the music festivals in the US, like dudes wear these war bonnets, you can buy it. It's really, really bad. Okay, all right, so what do we do about this? Proposal. Sioux people get to go to New York City and eye for an eye. What would that be? Wear a hoodie? It's not going to work, right? Or language of rights. Instead of eye for eye, language of rights. Sioux people should go to the music festivals and demand that the dudes stop. Not gonna work. Right? I mean, it's just going to be laughed at, and they know it. And anyway, it shouldn't be on the shoulders of Dakota Sioux. Like if they have a claim right against music festivals, that the Jews at music festivals not run war on, then that gives them an obligation to speak up. Why should they have to speak up in that way? So the book, each of the applied chapters of the book has some general things to say about what kinds of policies might be effective. And in general, I tend to shy away from proposing legal schemes and so of course, there's really good empirical evidence. In the chapter on duty ideas, there have been various jurisdictions that have tried to legislate the problem. And they've been completely effective. So, I mean, it might make you feel better to have a law that says you can't have, you know, just skinny models on billboard ads for clothing. It might make you feel better to say that, but it doesn't really actually change it. There's really good empirical evidence, sociology. So I think I want to like, think about the problem right now. Give us a chance of actually producing a better model. But we have a knee-jerk kind of tendency. Oh, let's talk about it. And I think rights are, don't get me wrong, rights are good, they're really important. Especially nowadays when they seem to be jeopardized, where suddenly realizing, oh, free speech really does matter. And not getting blasted in the face by pepper spray by your own government really matters. So don't get me wrong, it's just that in this case, I'm not sure it's the best approach.
Okay.
Those of you out there on YouTube, don't misquote me.
We'll check it out in a few days. Other things? Yeah. So I'll go ahead and ask, and you can still think about your question.
Yeah, it has to do with the Medusa syndrome. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Medusa syndrome has to do with identity, right? With some sort of essentialism or something to that effect. This is just a side note. I might be wrong. But again, I was thinking about multiculturalism because actually in the enlarged version of 95, Quaid Anthony Appiah is one of the respondents to Taylor.
Yeah.
In his objection, if my memory is good, is something to the effect that multiculturalism is good, identity politics has some sort of merit, well thought of. But what is identity? Identity is a script.
Yeah.
And we want our identities not to be too tightly scripted.
Yeah.
So something like that. So this was in 95. And so Appiah's argument seems to be at his stage that there's some sort of, I don't know, fluidity, let's say, to identity, and also this has of course to do with social autonomy and the right to social autonomy as seems to be putting the case here. So I was thinking about, I don't know if I'm construing this right now, but I was thinking about the relationship of this with recognition, official recognition, etc., and the way it can undercut insiders' influence on the determination of what culture is. So perhaps this is just a clarification question. Is your point that, let's say, official state recognition or official recognition by some entity that is like an outsider, let's say UNESCO,
Yeah.
or whatever, basically influences what it can influence what the aesthetic culture is in a way that seems to, basically take control away from insiders. This is what you're saying.
That's the idea. Insiders should have control. I think you and I have an interest in those people over there having control of them. And that's a fluid thing. I agree with Appiah that identity is more fluid than scholars who have identity. Even though when they're like insisting on this fluidity, they still take it not fluid. So I'm not sure exactly what the connection would be.
Yeah, this is right. And I'm just thinking about scenarios. Okay, so the Medusa syndrome can cause harm, right? And so official recognition can be harmful.
Yeah.
But the opposite scenario can also have misrecognition or no recognition at all, invisibility, let's say, is also a harm. So I guess that we have to I don't know if there's like a balance to be struck here, or I don't know in which instances should be for like cultures. I mean, members of cultures, including ethnic cultures, do have recognition claims concerning the visibility and recognition of their own cultures. And so I don't know.
Tom Shelby, in his book on solidarity, solidarity, has a chapter of cultural appropriation where he emphasizes, he's talking about rap, he emphasizes how important it is for Black rap artists to have a white audience so they can make a living, right? Simple, make a living so they can therefore make a living. And he's got to be right about that. So the view cannot be to put everybody under a glass jar and isolate them from everybody else. There has to be contact, as Schwab so the contact has to be, and it can even take the form of borrowing, so on. So here's, when the rubber hits the road, the proposal is that that the contact is fine so long as it ensures that the folks who are on the inside are doing better as insiders.
I think your question, especially that is a multiple cultural research, and what I can be with other different is the relation, not multiculturalism is a concept, on this day about the different types of culture. Not tell us about the relations inside each
Between cultures.
Yes, interculturality. I think it's a better concept with incorporates about the
That's the French version.
yes, it's different.
The French distinguish between interculturality and multiculturalism, but
No. It's different.
Yeah, it's two different things. Yeah, they distinguish.
This question is more about the multiculturalism. Epistemology, like the subject and object.
Yeah.
It is not interculturality. That's why the really questionability is more, I think, understandable by the concept of interculturality. Where you can experience the other when you go to China or when you go to another country, another place. Why are you able to be with them? To experience and change feelings about your experience in the other experience. It's not interculturalism. Where you can be confident in the other different also these different. Where you can look at what difference you can
we a little more than that, but I see, but I get your point. Other.
Can I just say something like that? Yeah, so just on this point, yeah, I think probably the word multiculturalism is very different. So I'm not sure we use the word concept. So what I'm proposing in the aesthetic case, maybe this doesn't work for all types of culture, but for aesthetic cultures, what I'm proposing is that you can have people from a lot of different aesthetic cultures who are interacting with each other. I'm having an experience of your culture, and that can affect your culture. And that is fine, so long as the effect that it has on your culture is not undermining your culture. And we have to recognize that there are power disparities. So some people who are people from a powerful culture are interacting with a relatively less powerful culture. are more likely to be the role of the china shop than the other. And I think that's the proposal that I have, whether you call that intercultural or multicultural, that's the idea. Sounds like.
I would like to continue the dialogue with you.
Critical theorists might spell this out in terms of the relationship between dominant cultures and minority cultures or oppressed cultures or whatever, but it's another kind of lingo, but perhaps they're saying more or less the same. It was just a side comment. Other things, I have an next question, but I really don't want to impose it, so.
Just curiosity, a philosophy. Could you develop a little bit more on your concept, on the concept of culture that you use? Yeah, because my problem is this: how do we truly know that we are insiders on the culture? Maybe we also need a critical distance within our culture, so we can confront, not in a fusion of horizons as in gathering, but in a conflict. And so, in a way, there's a possibility for me to need to borrow from other cultures, just to know myself a little bit within my. So is this something connected with the concept of culture you just used, sharing behaviors and?
So I find it very deflation. So I think that there's a lot of resistance to appeal to culture in social theory generally nowadays, right? And I think that is going to be we need some notion of culture. It's got to be one that's not treacherous. So I propose it's not my idea. It comes from Boyd and Richardson, philosophers of biology. Interesting, it comes from there. And it's taken up by Alan Patton, the philosopher. And so I get the idea from him. So minimal culture is a regularity of behavior due to shared learning and shared formative conditioning. Okay, so what are some examples of regularities of behavior? Well, there's zillions of them, right? So there's driving culture. There's a legal culture. Like the robes that the Portuguese judges wear are different from the robes that the Canadian judges wear. Like it's different culture. We make you shirts, and for Brazil they don't do that. The difference in linguistic culture. Small, right? But it's just a pattern of behavior. Why do you do that? You learn. Why do they do that? They learn. So it's really, really notice how like unimportant this is. So do we need differences in culture in that sense to appreciate our own cultural embedded? This problem. But there are probably some forms of culture that do give us a sense that we belong in cultures. I do think, I do think that it's not really until the late 18th century with people, with philosophers like McIver, that we really have a full understanding of ourselves as cultural animals. So that was an achievement, a late achievement. And it probably comes with certain cultures are apt to play that role. And artistic and aesthetic cultures, I think, are really good at playing that role of giving us a sense of who we are as different people. So in the 19th century, the notion of culture was not this minimal notion, it was an organic notion. So German culture is an organic whole whose parts are dependent on each other. None can be separated from the others, and they comprise family structure, legal structure, a political system, and religion, and our various arts of music and poetry and so on. And you know how German philosophers are like looking at this being created. They're seeing German culture being created before them. That's what I'm still interested in. Right? Hegel writes about Gulbenkian. Right? They're creating Germany. Right? They're in front of them. Right? It's being created. So no wonder they're so interested in that. But that's organic culture. So maybe organic cultures are really good at giving us that sense of ourselves as a cultural creature. Herder has a notion of adaptive culture. So an adaptive culture is an organic culture that fits you to your geographical circumstances. So the culture of the Germans is different from the culture of the Italians, because the Mediterranean is different from the world. That's. So I think that there are adaptive cultures like that, but it's a big mistake to think that all cultures are adaptive, and it's a big mistake to think that all cultures are organic. But maybe adaptive cultures are really good at doing the kind of thing that you're interested in. And then there's tailored identity cultures. Right? So this is in this Nagel book, but it's really sources of the self. There are cultures that are organic cultures, such that a threat to your culture is a threat to your personal existence. Yeah. So you just are who you are without your culture. And that's a very special thing. I think it's a very special thing. Okay, so I take notes with blue ink. You will never get me to use ink of another color. That is just my thing. But it's not part of who I am. It's not an entity, right? Or when I wear a tie, I don't like ties, so French ties. I like woven ties, Italian ties. So I have all these woven ties. But it's not my identity. You can take away my ties, I would still. So there's a lot of aesthetic cultures that are not identity involving. Interesting empirical studies came out a few years ago. Subjects were asked, given a scenario, you wake up tomorrow morning and you're changed and there is a certain respect. There are 3 respects. You're changed in a certain respect. Are you still the same person? Okay. You wake up tomorrow morning and you have a different religion. You wake up tomorrow morning, you were Catholic, now you're Mormon. You wake up tomorrow morning, you are kind of lefty, and tomorrow morning you wake up and you're a right winger. Right now, you're into like folk music, you wake up tomorrow morning and you're into heavy metal. So then the question is, bring to these, are you still the same person? Guess which has the biggest, not the same person effect? Music. People will say, oh, I changed my politics, I'm the same person. I changed my religion, I'm the same person. I changed my music, I'm the same person. So it's really ties, I don't think that is just I would be thinking, maybe I'm the same person.
Do you know what's the most tie in identity terms in Portugal? Football club. You can change everything. You can change your religion, your partner. You cannot change your football club. That is strictly forbidden. If someone changes their football club, we'll go like, oh, what's wrong with him? Or her. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think they didn't run the experiment with sporting events, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're stronger than these. It's not just Portugal.
Probably the sport changes. It's comparable. The sport changes, but the league.
For us, it's hockey, yes.
Other things? If not, I just have one question out of curiosity and close. It's the relationship between systemic injustice. Because you were very quickly making the distinction between systemic injustice and aesthetic injustice. You're saying that aesthetic injustice is metaphysical. It has to do with agents' capacity to acquire knowledge, etc. I wonder if they are related though, because I can see how, in what concerns modern injustice, there's probably no relation,
But I wonder about hermeneutical injustice. Because hermeneutical injustice has to do with the person's capacity to influence his or her social experiences and his or her identity concerning precisely this experience and the category that we have, etc. I would say that our own aesthetic is a fundamental hermeneutical tool in order for us to understand who we are. Let's say. So in some cases of aesthetic justice and dispossession, I would argue that if aesthetic injustice would be a source of harm of hermeneutical injustice. But this is just me. Good.
So I think that there are causal connections between academic injustice, aesthetic injustice, and
Okay.
I think that there's connections between them. There's actually a paper by in Brazil, which points to that. So if you're interested, I can give you the reference. So I think that there was connections, but I don't think that they're the same thing. So aesthetic injustice pertaining to social autonomy is when your actions do not make the profile of the culture. Okay, you have, here's testimonial aesthetic injustice. This matters. Why early anthropologists went up to these places to Hawaii, India, First Nations communities, and they didn't listen to the experts. The experts, the artists would say, here's what's going on. And they had a methodology that actually prohibited them from weighing experts. They thought experts were going to be going on. And so that's testimonial injustice. And then hermeneutical injustice. Once you have a picture that sets in of what okay, no, here I'm going to just look back what I was about to say. So I think there's testimonial injustice. I'm going to push back on hermeneutical injustice because it could be that, let's say the Medusa syndrome is very intense and the national understanding of pop culture becomes internalized. It's becoming internalized means that there's an aesthetic injustice because now people are determining the profile is. But the insiders might understand perfectly well what that internalized conception is.
Except if the outsider's influence somehow changes fundamentally the aesthetic culture to the point in which the insider no longer recognizes him or herself in the meaning of that aesthetic culture. Ergo doesn't understand his or her social experiences in relation to that aesthetic culture, and so he or her suffers from hermeneutical injustice due to aesthetic injustice. But this is just like that.
No, this is nice because I should make the assumption that when the outsiders impose a profile on insiders, that the profile is one that they can't control. Maybe some of us just are never going to think. There's always going to be.
What if there's a misunderstanding?
It's always going to feel wrong. It's always going to be some tension, some friction. Maybe they feel interest for the outsider profile so that they can make a lot of stuff that they can sell. Right. But maybe it just never really resonates, never really does. Yeah, and so then they can't understand themselves. Because they're trying to understand themselves using borrowed concepts. This is the deep point in Fricker's book that when the concept is wrong, it's just never going to be wrong. Like when women in the old days saw the sexual harassment as unwanted flirting, that never fit well, right? It was always like, that's the only way I have to think of it, but it doesn't seem like it's not true to my experience. It's always something in the experience pushing against them.
humanities, with the lack of principle that prevent them from defending their own social experiences. And then when the term harassment was coined, somehow they managed to, solve the puzzle of their own experience.
But they
This
might
case would
have-
be different. This case would be different because
No, they might have had a different concept. Like, I think unwanted floating.
Okay.
That's unwanted floating, but why does it make me feel so bad? So there was a concept that was there, and it just never worked.
Sure.
So kids have to work for us, they have to be true to our experience. So if you're hiding on it and you've got this imposed, externally imposed concept, it's never going to work. Yeah, so that I think is a really, I had a problem with that.
Okay, anything else? Okay, so if not, I'll just thank Tom once again, also the people here in the room and the people watching on YouTube, and just reminding you that we do have the third workshop. I was checking the dates, maybe I said the 26th, but that's the meeting group, it's on the 28th, it's on Wednesday, okay? Same place, same time, Faculdade de Letras do McIver, MPTF, at 3 p.m. Or on the 28th for Dom's third workshop on aesthetic pluralism. Thank you again, Dom.